I really truly can't think of a better person to have open WordWorks, which is the series that we designed specifically for writers. We conceived of it as a kind of a toolbox or a bag of tricks or a wizard's wand for writers. So glad she's here. Though the series was designed for writers, I want to make it clear that for all of you non-writers like me, if you're just simply a Kelly Link fan, you're more than welcome here too. Kelly is just famously quotable and full of great advice for writers, like advice on what to listen to as you're writing, which is of course the same music for as you're working on a story, because that helps you keep the voice consistent throughout the whole thing, unless you want to make a big dramatic shift and then it's change the music. Or this, you get a lot of narrative energy from people who make really big mistakes, people who act against their best interests. It's very hard to make a story out of people doing the right thing over and over again. Or her advice that you should never poison a witch. But here's one that's really useful for writers. She said, "I'd be flattered if someone said that my work is too weird for them. I value the uncompliment." Hugo House, as you probably know, is important for writers in part because we really appreciate things that are too weird. And right now, as I know, probably many of you know, we are working on designing a perfect new permanent home for Hugo House. We're trying to design in a brand new space, a place that would have all of the quirks and twists of the weird writerly soul. Thanks to the Fried Art Museum, we are currently located right next door to this place, but in June of 2018, we're going to be moving into this brand new home at our original location across from Cal Anderson Park. It's a huge project, but then isn't everything worth doing really a huge project? So we're determined to pull it together and raise the money that we need to make this happen, because writers really need Hugo House, and Seattle needs to keep weird in its vocabulary. So if you'd like to know more about this project or what's going on, or if you want to get involved, find me at the Intermission or after the event, or you can email me at tree@hugohouse.org. So quickly, you should know about a couple of upcoming events. You can find all the information on what's going on and many other events on our website. On next Friday, 9/15, we're going to have our first literary series with Megan Daum, Solmaz Sharif, and our own Sonora Shah, our writer-in-residence, as well as musician Joy Mills. And then on September 28th, Frances McHugh, who was the founding executive director of Hugo House, will be reading from Timber Curtain. And it's her new book that's also the narration for a film. So at this event, there will be some of the clips from the film. The film is called Where the House Was, but the book, Timber Curtain, is an extraordinary book. It's partly about the old Hugo House, but it's really about the myths of place that we create for ourselves. So let's see, please fill out the surveys at Intermission. Our funders want to know who comes to our events and what they think. Our funders include Amazon, Arts Fund, For Culture, the Office of Arts and Culture, the National Endowment for the Arts, and media sponsors, The Strangers, A&P, and KUOW. So that's enough of me already. Here's what we're up to tonight. Ramon Isao is going to introduce Kelly Link, and we'll also have a conversation with her after the intermission, and there will be time for Q&A from the audience at the end of that. And books are for sale out front, and Kelly Link is willing to sign books at the end of the evening in the foyer. So before he comes up here, I just want to tell you that Ramon Isao is a recipient of the Tim McGinnis Award for Fiction, as well as a writing fellowship from the Jack Straw Cultural Center. He is a much beloved teacher at Hugo House and also the leader of our teen youth cohort. His stories have appeared in the Iowa Review, Ninth Letter, Hobart, and the American Reader. He's also an award-winning screenwriter whose screenplay credits include Dead Body, Zombies of Mass Destruction, and Junk, in which he co-stars. Ramon.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Is that about the right volume? Feeling good? Yeah? Thank you guys so much for coming out tonight. This is amazing. It's a huge victory for fiction, but it's also like a huge victory for the short story, I think, that everybody's out right now. I feel like increasingly I feel like we find ourselves in an age obsessed with answers. I think because they're so easily and readily at hand, not even necessarily the right answers or the wrong answers, just answers all over the place. And this is, I think, particularly detrimental to the practice of art, and in particular, I think it's detrimental to the practice of the short story in some ways. I think the short story traditionally has held very little love for the easy answer, right? And to illustrate this, I remember a professor of mine once told me, speaking of fiction, that with short stories, you must never build a house too perfectly for it to be haunted. And so enter Kelly Link, whose stories from the floor to the ceiling to the cobwebs and the corners are some of the most haunted stories I can think of. Not merely by ghosts and zombies, though they are afoot, but by our understanding of what ghosts and zombies even are, what they mean, what they represent, as in the Hortlack. Yay, Hortlack, woo, yeah. Hell, Link will completely uproot our understanding of character, as in the Susan-making machine, how time works, or how the fundamentals of narration work, as in the rushing nesting dolls of stories that we see in Lull. In fact, all three of those features are in the same story, Lull, which is like one of my all-time favorite short stories. It's the closing story in Magic for Beginners, available for sale on the table. I am personally so excited to be able to sit and listen to her shed some light on the stories I've loved that have confounded me like no other. It's interesting too, I am a huge fan of Kelly Link's work, of course, but I don't think there's any collection of short stories that I am as in love with as I am confounded by, you know? And I love that particular confluence of emotions that happens when I read her stories. As most of my students know, I don't know exactly what's happening in Stone Animals or at the end of Two Houses, but it's exactly in that not knowing where new possibilities and even new universes and even new emotions can open up. It feels to me the way very little fiction has felt to me since my childhood, which is that it's some kind of magic, almost. And in speaking to a lot of my writer buddies and colleagues before this event, saying, oh, what should I ask, the number one question that everyone said is, how does she do it? I swear to God, every single one of them. So, or is it that, or are they perfectly, meticulously engineered to be strange in exactly the right ways? I don't know. But I do, oh, you know what, I'm so sorry, I was never handed a bio. Let me grab your book. This is all going smoothly. Attention, this is all going very smoothly. Again, none of this is happening. All right. So, Kelly Link is the author of the collections Get in Trouble, Stranger Things Happen, Magic for Beginners, and Pretty Monsters. She is the co-founder of Small Beer Press. And her short stories have been published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. I love that you listed that one first in your bio. That was such a awesome fist in the air. The Best American Short Stories and prize stories, the O. Henry Awards. She has received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, and Link was born in Miami, Florida. She currently lives with her husband and daughter in Northampton, Massachusetts. Ladies and gentlemen, please put them together for Kelly Link.
I did not realize that I was going to be opening this, so thank you for the honor. I've wanted to come out and do something at Hugo House for a while, so I'm very, very happy to be here. And thank you for the introduction. I was thinking about the uncompliment, which is actually very dear to my heart, and I think in part the uncompliment is sort of a comfortable enough experience if you also have things like people saying really nice things about you in introductions. But maybe 5 months ago now, I went, as writers do, to look at Amazon and see what people had said about my book. And there was a very short review that just said, "This is the worst book I have ever read." And I was really, really happy. And I thought, this is actually in some ways much better than somebody saying, well, you're in my top 20, because it's still a superlative. And I thought, and I did, when I looked at other books that she had reviewed to make sure it really was the worst book, and I thought maybe once a year I will go back and make sure that I'm slipped from the slot, because it's amazing to be the worst book somebody has read, but if I were to fall to the third worst book that somebody had read, I would, well, then I'd never write another book. But there is something nice about somebody having, sort of an emotional, visceral response, in which that response is, I really hated that. It almost feels familial. It's just like, I can't believe you did that. And this is not part of the talk, but I was thinking about the question of what do things mean, or sort of, how do you interpret a story? And I think for a long time I thought that that sort of the desire, the sort of writerly desire to leave stuff maybe satisfying in some way, but not to give definitive answers, was sort of a consequence, or sort of the outcome of really having loved for a long time being in workshops and hearing people give very different interpretations of what a story is about, or what happens in a story, or what something means. And then I think in the last 2 years, what I've started thinking about is, my father was a minister, and I went to church every Sunday for most of my life until I went off to college. And I think it's equally a product of going to church every Sunday. Often people are talking about the same text, often it's the same pastor talking about the same text, but somehow they have managed to come up with an entirely different point or story that they want to make from the very short piece of text that they have selected. And I think that was probably a really useful thing to take in terms of storytelling, and the fact that stories can have such variable meanings for different readers. That, and the fact that my father went from being a pastor to being a psychologist, which is really in the same ballpark. So I'm gonna, before I sort of give my talk, I was gonna, my husband is from Scotland, and we've ended up every year now having a Robert Burns night. And so a couple of years ago, we were going through an anthology. People just pull poetry off the shelf and read poems. And there's a Scottish writer, Ian Crichton Smith, that wrote some short stories and also a lot of poetry. And so I'm going to read a couple of selections from a poem of his called Gaelic Stories. 1. A fisherman in Wellington's and his sweetheart and his mother. 2, a story about an old man and a seal. 3, a woman reading a Bible for 7 years, waiting for a sailor. 4, a melodeon, a peat stack, an owl. 5, a croft, 2 brothers, a plate with potatoes. 8, a man who was in Australia coming home on a wedding night. 9, a romance between a cheese and a milk. 11, 2 women talking in a black house. 12, a monster rising from the sea. Will you take tea? 14, a conversation between a loaf and a cheese. 15, a conversation between a Wellington and a herring. 16, a conversation between fresh butter and a cup. 17, a conversation between Yarmouth and Garabast. 18, a moon hard and high above a marsh. And then the talk that I'm going to give is, the title of it is sort of very loosely, a vampire is a flexible metaphor. And I'm going to talk some about the ways that writers use the fantastic in fiction. And I'm also going to talk some about one of my favorite writers, a writer named Joan Aiken, who didn't actually write any vampire stories that I'm aware of. In 1924, the writer Joan Aiken was born in a haunted house on Mermaid Street in Rye, England. Her father was the poet Conrad Aiken, perhaps most famous now for his short story, Silent Snow, Secret Snow. Her stepfather, Martin Armstrong, was as well a poet. Joan Aiken's sister and brother, Jane Aiken Hodge and John Aiken, like Joan, became writers. Aiken wrote her first novel at the age of 16 and sold her first story to the BBC around the same time. In the 50s and 60s, she worked on the short story magazine Argosy, and from 1964 on, she wrote 2 books a year, more roughly 100 in all. She wrote Gothics, mysteries, children's novels, Jane Austen pastiches, and an excellent book for would-be authors, The Way to Write for Children. Her first book was the collection All You've Ever Wanted and Other Stories, followed by a second book of short stories, More Than You Bargained For. Stories from these collections were published in a kind of omnibus in the US, Not What You Expected, which was the first book by Aiken that I ever read. Her series of alternate history novels for children, a Dickensian sequence that starts with The Wolves of Wilby Chase, has stayed in print, I believe, almost continuously since she began writing it. Although I still remember being told by her agent, Charles Schlesinger, that when he delivered The Wolves of Wilby Chase to her publisher, her editor asked if Aiken would consider sending them another collection instead, because collections sold better than novels. And the world is a very different place now. The Wolves sequence is bursting to the seams with wolves, exiled royalty, sinister governesses, spies, a goose boy, and plucky orphans, and of course the eponymous wolves. The Telegraph said of Aiken that her prose style drew heavily on fairy tales and oral traditions, in which plots are fast-moving and horror is matter of fact, but never grotesque. Not that there's anything wrong with grotesque. Many, many years ago, I had a part-time job at a children's bookstore, which mostly and happily entailed reading the stock that we carried so that we could make recommendations to adults who came in looking to buy books for their children. Our customers were almost never children. I reread the still ongoing Wolves novels and then began to track down the Aiken collections that I had checked out at the Coral Gables Library to read as a child, collections whose titles still enticed: The Far Forest, The Faithless Lolly Bird, A Harp of Fish Bones. When eventually I moved to Boston, I got another job at another bookstore, this one a secondhand shop on Newbury Street. In parts that I had a first-hand shot at hunting down out-of-print books for myself. And I can still remember the moment at which, standing at the top of a platform ladder, because the shelves are very high on wheels, to reach the uppermost shelf to find something for a customer, I found Joan Aiken's first novel, The Kingdom in the Cave, as if it had only just appeared there, which it probably had just appeared there. The owner of the bookstore sometimes has hundreds of books per day. Now, of course, it's quite possible to go online and find almost any book that you're looking for. The world is a very different place now. I recently spent maybe a year and a half now ago a weekend in Key West at a festival where the organizing theme was short stories. It's very delightful for me. There was much discussion on panels of the challenges that short stories present to their readers. The general feeling was that short stories could be difficult because their subject matter was so often grim, tragic. A novel you had time to settle into. Novels wanted you to like them, it was agreed, whereas short stories were like Tuesday's Child full of woe and required a certain kind of moral fortitude to properly digest. And yet it has always seemed to me that short stories have a kind of wild delight to them, even when their subject is grim. They come at you in a rush and spin you about in a kind of unsettling way, and then they go rushing off again. There's a kind of joy in the speed and compression necessary to make something very large happen in a small space. In contemporary short fiction, sometimes it's the sometimes it's the language of the story that transmits the livewire shock. Sometimes the structure of the story itself, the container, the way it unfolds, is the thing that startles or energizes or joyfully dislodges the reader. But it does seem to me that for quite a long period of time in the previous century, the subject matter of literary short stories was somewhat sedate. Marriages, affairs, the loss of love, personal tragedies, moments of self-realization. The weird and the gothic and the fanciful mostly existed in pockets of genre: science fiction, fantasy, horror, mystery, children's literature, some experimental fiction. As if literature were a series of walled gardens and not all the same forest. We had almost nothing in the vein of Joan Aiken's short stories, which practically spill over with mythological creatures and strange incident and mordant humor. And yet at the time when she began to write them, in the 1950s, when Aiken was an editor at Argosy, as well as a featured author there were any number of popular fiction magazines publishing writers like John Collier, O. Henry, Sylvia Townsend Warner, Ray Bradbury, Roald Dahl. Magazines have smaller circulations now. There are fewer popular magazines now. In fact, at the same literary festival focusing on the short story, there was a man there who had worked for a long time at the New Yorker on the fiction side, and he talked about some of the writers who had had long careers at the New Yorker, and listed off a bunch of people that you would know, and then he mentioned Sylvia Townsend Warner and kind of paused, and he said, I really don't know why we kept on publishing her. She's a very strange writer. She wrote a lot of stories about fairies, which are collected in a book called The Kingdom of Elfin. And, I think she actually, there's some connective tissue between some of the kind of stories that Chris Adrian has published in the New Yorker and the kind of work that she published there. But I think now she, at least during this editor who was working more when the magazine was publishing writers like Ann Tyler, she seemed kind of a peculiarity. So there are fewer popular magazines now that publish fiction, and yet there are, once again, many established and critically acclaimed, as well as new and startlingly brilliant writers working in the fantastic mode in these popular magazines. The jolt that this kind of writing gives its reader is the pleasure of the unreal and the real, the collaborative effort that imagining an impossible thing requires of such a story's reader as well as its writer. Particular joys of a Joan Aiken story have always been her capacity for this kind of brisk invention, her ear for dialect, her characters and their idiosyncrasies. And maybe 4 years ago, my partner and I, my husband, Gavin, who I run the press with, and I decided that we would put together sort of a new omnibus of Joan Aiken's best short stories. And so in the omnibus, which we called the People in the Castle, are some of the very first stories of hers that I ever fell in love with, starting with the title story, The People in the Castle, which is a variation on the classic tale of fairy wives. There are ghost stories, one story is called The Cold Flame, and another one is called Humble Puppy, and it's about a puppy. But The Cold Flame involves a volcano, a poet, and a magic-wielding Freudian mother, while the other is sort of a ghost story about a puppy designed to make certain readers cry, or else not even read it. People who dog stories make sad. But we went through every single one of Joan Aiken's short stories. We talked over our choices with her daughter Liza, reworked the table of contents. We had to take out one short story, which was one of my favorites, but which is really a terrifying story about lodgers who eventually capture the soul or the ghost of one of the children who dies. Sort of goes chasing around the garden when the child is dying, and with a jar to catch the spirit in. And I love that story. It's really creepy and weird, but Liza, her daughter, said, I would prefer we didn't use that because they were modeled on real people who were lodgers of ours for a while. And I never liked that story. So aside from that, where we had to be like, okay, that's fine, there was great pleasure in reading and then rereading and then transcribing stories like Hope, in which a harp teacher goes down the wrong alley and encounters the devil. There's a story called A Leg Full of Rubies, which in its wealth of invention is kind of the quintessential Joan Aiken short story. A man named Theseus O'Brien comes into a small town with an owl on his shoulder and accidentally inherits a veterinary practice, a collection of caged birds, including a malignant phoenix, and a prosthetic leg full of rubies, which is being used to hold up the corner of a kitchen table. Joan Aiken was the era of writers like Saki, Gita Maupassant, and all the masters of the ghost story, Emma James, E.F. Benson, Marjorie Bowen. And I can't help but, when I was putting the book together, couldn't help but imagine that readers who were going to come across these stories would come away with the desire to write like them, stories that were wild and astonishing and fertile. In 2002, the International Conference on the Fantastic, which is a pretty good conference, invited Joan Aiken to be its guest, and I went in order to hear her speak. She was so small that when it was time for her to give her lecture, she could not be seen over the podium. And so finally someone went and found a phone book, and she stood on that. She talked about how her stepfather, Martin Armstrong, had been impatient in the morning at the breakfast table when the children wanted to tell dreams that they had had. Other people's dreams are, he said, boring. And then Joan Aiken proceeded in her lecture to tell the audience about a city that she visited and a series of recurring dreams. She said that it was a city that existed in the real world, and that after walking its streets for so many years in dreams, she knew it as well as she knew London or New York, which were two cities where she had lived. In this dream city, she said, was everyone she had ever loved, both the living and the dead. And the audience, most of us, were pretty riveted. And did she talk about anything else? I don't remember. All I recall is her dream, and that she stood on a phone book. And I got a quote from Heart of Darkness, a book that I've actually never read, but I do like this quote, where Conrad says, "It seems to me that I am trying to tell you a dream, making a vain attempt because no relation of a dream can convey the dream sensation, that commingling of absurdity, surprise, and bewilderment, in a tremor of struggling revolt, that notion of being captured by the incredible, which is of the very essence of dreams. No, it is impossible. And yet this is the value, I think, of fiction and the tradition of the fantastic and the uncanny, the value of ghost stories, fairy tales, vampire stories. After all, we spend a third of our life asleep. Every night we dream dreams that we mostly don't remember. We process the things that happen to us in our life, the things that, whether or not we wish to, we must live through by converting them into dream narratives, which upon waking are fragmentary, diffuse, and yet the pieces that we do remember are extraordinarily vivid. We dream that we can fly, we dream that we encounter monsters, that we become monsters, we dream that we are other people. We dream that we find ourselves in strange landscapes. In fact, these dreams are so common to all people that in fact you can buy whole books which sort of list the most common dreams that people have and the things that people think that they mean. The work of writers like Stephen King, J.K. Rowling, and Borges, and Joan Aiken, and Catherine Davis, and Lyudmila Petrushevskaya is to fuse together the waking life and the dreaming life of their readers. I grew up reading fairy tales and ghost stories and the John Carter of Mars books, Tolkien and M.R. James and Susan Cooper, Joan Aiken, Stephen King, Dracula, Interview with the Vampire. When I began to write my own stories, I borrowed from these structures, rhythms, patterns, and from well-established, well-trodden genres, fairy tales, ghost stories, detective stories, romances, even though what I also wanted to do was write about contemporary life. I was trying to figure out what kind of story I could make work. It seemed to me that for me to write about one thing, fantasy, I needed the other. Adolescents with bad taste in music, babysitters, bad dates, and vice versa. I wanted unreal toads in the real garden. I wanted what Le Guin calls the real and the unreal. And now that I've been writing this kind of story for a while, I think there are a couple of things that I've been forced to think about by either teaching or by doing things like this. I've been figuring out some of the reasons why the beds, the structures that I started out borrowing because I didn't know what else to do worked well enough eventually. And I think maybe, I along the way figured out some things about why writers like myself write these kinds of stories, but also why readers like myself respond to them. Here's the thing about fairy tales and ghost stories, and here's the thing about vampires. Even readers who mostly prefer realistic fiction have some kind of familiarity with fairy tales. Sleeping Beauty, Snow White, Beauty and the Beast. Everyone knows a ghost story, and I'm going to tell a couple if there's time. Certain kinds of fantasy and science fiction are cultural touchstones now. Star Wars, hobbits, magic schools, talking animals, haunted house, vampires. And anytime that I say one of those words, I'm calling up a kind of association based on what you know of the fairy tales or what haunted houses you think of. That those are words that sort of call out a response, a mental response. For someone like me, a short story writer, for any kind of storyteller, this kind of call and response is extremely useful. Compression, elision, even sort of the mystery of something that doesn't actually exist, or basic tools for short story writing, for any kind of narrative, actually, but especially for short stories. Anything that makes the story larger on the inside than it is on the outside. When I incorporate fantastic elements, I'm putting stories inside stories. I'm taking advantage of a kind of cultural echo, a call and response. The reader engages with me in a collaboration where jointly we create something that can only exist by an act of faith or imagination. The reader who engages in a collaborative act becomes more deeply invested in the story because she is telling it to herself too. Poetry works this way as well, of course. Think of the Crichton Smith poem, Two Women Talking in a Black House. It's an invitation to the person who hears the poem Who are the women? What is the relationship? What is the thing that makes the house so black, so sinister? What is the story here? And your story and the things that you picture are going to be different from mine. It's the same thing with vampires or with any other introduction of the fantastic into a story or a novel. It's an invitation to the reader. It says, there is a story here. When a writer introduces a ghost, a witch, a zombie, a monster, they are saying to the reader, here's something that you know isn't true, but I'm going to do my best to help you convince yourself that in the space of this story, you can believe that an impossible thing exists. Rather than true or false, it's true and false. Or sometimes it's a decision that you're leaving up to the reader. Is this a ghost story, or is the hero of the story going through a nervous breakdown? And if it is a ghost story, how about that? What does a ghost mean? What are the personal and cultural meanings that the reader attaches to a ghost in a story? Ghosts or vampires or witches have a narrative shape to them because they are even inside of it, before they're even inside of a story, because they only exist in stories. Back to the vampire. There are certain kinds of patterns or tropes, sometimes very location specific. In New Orleans or Louisiana or Mystic Falls, you have oversexed, shirtless, very broody vampires. In the Pacific Northwest, the attractiveness of vampires is so literalized that they sparkle in the sun, as if they were carved out of gemstones. There's Anne Rice, Dracula, Twilight, there's the Count from Sesame Street. There's Vampire Diaries, True Blood. There is so much story already present in so many different forms that the writer gets to decide how it should be used, whether to subvert it, to layer, or to poke fun at these things. One of the things that I thought about when I was sort of thinking about the point of vampires in a story, I was doing that because a writer that I work with, Holly Black, was writing a book called Coldest Girl in Cold Town. And she methodically went through pretty much all the vampire lore that she could find. And there's some really great books out there. There's a Paul Barber book called Something, Death, and Burial, which has a lot of historical stuff in it. It's also a very fun read. But anyway, a lot of the lore is, you can't put it all in the story. It doesn't all go together. So you kind of select, well, will these vampires be able to see themselves in a mirror? What about garlic? How do they die? How does one become a vampire? And these are all decisions that the writer has to make, or sort of, leave up to the reader, depending on the kind of story it is, to draw from other stories because they know the patterns already. Her story was specifically about, she wanted to write about reality television. And so her vampires had to be seen on camera, otherwise there'd be very little point to them. But sort of the topic of vampire, sort of the idea of what a vampire is broad enough that she could sort of do that without having to say to the reader, well, there's a reason why these vampires are special. It's sort of, there's a lot of floating, sort of, once you put the idea of vampire out, there's a lot of stuff floating around it. You can sort of pull in what you want. So as you are pulling in the kinds of elements of a piece of folktale or a sort of fantastic element and making these decisions, even the stories that you are not using are still, some of them at least, going to be in the head of the reader. You have very little control of that, but even the fact that those stories exist, sort of beside the story that you were telling, is very economical. It sort of increases the size of the story. It's a little postmodern, which is inevitable. You get, because they're vampires, death, sex, and of course sex and death, all sort of smushed together. You think about what vampires sort of represent in the cultural idea. They represent change, but they also represent stagnation. Sort of both of these things simultaneously. The idea of contagion, the transmission of a curse or a piece of heritage or a story through blood. And of course they stand in for the loss of self, the loss of agency, having to keep oneself secret, one's real self secret, the possibility of something lasting forever, love, hate, grief. Every reader is going to have inside of them a vampire-shaped space in their brain, which is partly cultural, partly personal. You, the person who reads the story, sort of decides sort of the scope of the meaning of the thing in the story that only exists in stories. You are sort of creating it as much as the writer does. The writer puts the vampire into the story and suggests the outlines. They pick the details, but the reader is the one who inhabits the story and sort of makes a lot of those decisions outside of what the writer is doing. A ghost story or a monster story or fairy tale is a story that can't entirely disguise the fact that it is a story. Genres have standard moves, patterns, endings. The patterns are often so familiar that in 2018, a writer can subvert those patterns when they're working with a very fixed genre. And then you have the pattern, and you have the break in the pattern too. When a reader thinks they know what is going to happen in a story, and the writer subverts or reverses that pattern in some way, the reader begins to pay more attention to the story. Because they think, oh, I didn't know that would happen. When I write, I think about the kinds of stories that people like best. I mean the stories that people tell us, the stories that we tell. We like to hear stories about people doing stupid things and getting caught. We like to hear secrets. When someone says, want to hear something really weird, most of us are going to keep listening, and the only way we'll be disappointed is if the story isn't weird enough. We don't necessarily want a ghost story explained. Most readers, or maybe what I should say is the readers that I am interested in and that I feel that I'm included in, want the moments in stories where things become freaky or numinous, or where the everyday begins to feel as if it's overlaid by another kind of pattern. We are entertained by stories of people who do unexpected things. We are troubled by stories about people who turn out not to be who we thought they were. We crave stories that mirror in some way our own experience of the world, in which surprising and inexplicable things happen. And in turn, we use these kinds of stories to process our own experiences. In 2009, I had a daughter who was born at 24 weeks, and her birth weight was 1.5 pounds, which is less than a bag of sugar. And my husband's wedding ring fit around her wrist, which is a thing that NICUs will do when you have a very premature baby. They'll often have pictures on the wall of other premature babies with wedding rings around their wrists. And then they say, maybe you would like to do that. And you think, well, this is apparently a thing that people do. So you're like, sure. She spent 4 months in the NICU in an incubator hooked up to a ventilator, and during the day and overnight when we would sit beside the isolette, which is what the incubator was called, what I thought of as astronauts. There are a lot of photos of her in which there's sort of the port, the window port, which is circular, which really to me looked like the kind of thing that you would see in an illustration of a spaceship, very old-fashioned illustration. I thought of fairy tales like Sleeping Beauty. I thought of Thumbelina. When she was born, she was covered in lanugo, which is a kind of downy hair, and I thought of werewolves. There was nothing in my experience of the real world which had been particularly useful preparation. Though perhaps childbirth is always closer to the fantastic than other kinds of experiences are because it is so extreme. She came home for good when she was 14 months old, and she's fine now. But during the first 4 months, when she was in the NICU, we had to wash our hands in these metal troughs for 2 minutes and watch the clock while we did it. And I began to have sort of an understanding of ghost stories and the idea that ghosts would haunt a particular place because that pattern of repetition was so intense and so ritualistic that I thought, I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life, to the point where I'll have to do it when I die too. And you know, I think that many of the, I'm going to tell a couple of actual ghost stories here. And you know, I think that oftentimes ghost stories are either associated with children or with the experience of childhood. And I don't really know, I can think of some reasons why, but you know, I know very few adult friends who have had adult experiences with ghosts. And so these are two stories about a friend that who lives in my town now, the town is the town of Northampton. She lived in another town in Western Mass when she was a child, in a house that she said her family was very dysfunctional, but she also said nobody ever really liked being in that house, and that she had a brother and a sister, and it was a very particular kind of Massachusetts house, 2 stories, going very, very far back, with all the rooms, kind of like a railroad, but with a hallway. So the downstairs was a living room and a kitchen, living room, dining room, kitchen, and then above it, there was a staircase that went upstairs, and then bedroom, 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 and she had her own bedroom, which was right off the landing at the top of the stairs, and she originally her bed was against the wall by the stairs, and she could not sleep very well, so finally she moved her bed to the other wall and slept much better. But the night before Christmas, when she was maybe 11 or 12, she had already gone to bed, but was not asleep, and she heard her siblings were already in their beds and asleep. Her parents were downstairs, and she heard somebody begin to come up the stairs, and when they would have gotten to the top of the landing, she should have been able to see them through her door, but there was nobody there. And she said there was kind of a pause, and she was sort of looking at the landing, and then she heard somebody begin to go down the stairs again, and so she thought, well, that's weird. And then she heard somebody start to go up the stairs again, and so she counted, and when they should have been at the landing again, there was still nobody there. It was just the hallway. And she said, and then they turned and they went back down the stairs again. And she said whoever it was, did that over and over again for about 15 minutes until her mother yelled from the living room, would you kids fucking go to sleep? And she said that the footsteps stopped for about an hour. But then they started up again after her parents had gone to bed, and somebody was going up and down the stairs, she said, for most of the night. And she said when she was older in that house, when she was in high school, she had to keep a sort of scrapbook diary as a class project. And she had gone to see a U2 concert and then came home, and she was a pain 6 months. She didn't actually like U2, but she had gone to the concert, and she came back and she did sort of wrote about it, and she sort of got to the point where she was going to glue in her ticket. And she's still her family was very disorganized. She was a very organized person. And so she reached for the glue stick and it was not there. And so she looked for the glue stick in her drawers, she looked under her desk and behind her desk, and it wasn't there. And so she sort of stood up and she turned around and it was on her pillow. And she thought, well, that's weird. And so she got the glue stick and she glued the ticket in, and then she did some more work, and then reached for the glue stick again, and it was gone. And so she looked under the desk and around the desk first, and then she was like, fine, and she looked, and she expected it to be in the pillow, but it was not. And so she felt very freaked out, and she went downstairs, and through the living room, the dining room, and into the kitchen. She thought, I will make a sandwich, and then I'll feel better. And she opened the cheese drawer, and there was the glue stick. And so maybe a year ago, I told that story at a reading, and a woman came up to me and she said, what town did your friend live in? And I told her, and she said, oh, it's not my town. Because she was about the same age. And she said that she had lived in a similar sort of row house, but where there had been rooms on either side of the corridor. And in fact, she had lived in that house with her grandmother, with her parents, but also with her aunt and uncle and her cousins. And she would sit at night when they were supposed to be asleep in her door, and across the hall, her cousin would sit in her doorway, and the hallway was very creaky, so they couldn't go into each other's rooms, but they could sit and they could play cards in the hallway, sort of from their doors. And they did this a lot. And then one night as they were doing this, they sort of began to have a feeling that somebody was watching, and they looked to the end of the hall, and there's a woman standing there in very, very old-fashioned clothing. And at first they thought, that's our grandmother playing a trick on us. And they thought, no, that's not our grandmother. And she said, without saying anything to each other, they both got up and went back into their rooms. And she said she was petrified, and she went to sleep. Or she closed her eyes and sort of lay there. And as she lay there, she said she heard somebody come down the hall, and a woman said, "You kids should be asleep." And she said after that they did not play cards in the hall, but also they didn't talk about it because they had the feeling they shouldn't talk about it. And so years later, when she was in college, she came back home again for Thanksgiving, and her cousin was there, and her whole family was there. And she was clearing dishes off the table to bring to the kitchen. And inside the kitchen, she heard somebody scream and drop a bunch of dishes. And so she went in, and her cousin had dropped all the dishes because her aunt had just said to her mother, "I saw that ghost again last night." And it turned out that everybody in the family had seen the ghost, but mostly they'd seen the ghost as children, and nobody ever talked about it. So this was the first time that anybody in the family had ever said anything about it in front of other people. So her cousins had dropped the dishes. And then I'm going to tell one more story, which is a story from Greensboro. I have a really good friend who I met in college, but who kind of had a very peripatetic life all over North Carolina, and lived in Asheville for a while before he and his mother moved to Greensboro. And in Greensboro, they moved into a hunting lodge that had been converted into a rental property. And he said there was sort of the big space with the fireplace and everything in the middle. His mother's bedroom was on one side, and his bedroom was on the other side of the house. And he said that often when he was falling asleep, they were surrounded, there was a quarry pit, there was a lot of woods around the house. And late at night he would wake up, in the middle of the night he would wake up because he could hear somebody chopping wood. And there was something upsetting about it, but also very mundane. So he never thought, well, I should really go figure out what that is. He just would think, why the hell is somebody chopping wood in the middle of the night? But then he'd go back to sleep. And so years later, as a grown-up, his mother and he were talking about some of the places that they had lived in North Carolina, and she said, they were talking about the house in Asheville, and she said that was the last place we ever heard that ghost chopping wood. And he said, what do you mean? She said, well, it used to be wherever we lived, in the middle of the night, we would hear somebody chopping wood outside the house. But the Asheville was the last time we heard that. We didn't hear that when we moved to Greensboro. He said, no, you didn't hear it because your bedroom's on the opposite side of the house. I still heard it. So these are stories which don't really have, it's not as if there's a moral to them. It's not as if there's an explanation that makes a lot of sense. But they have sort of a charge to them. And there's something that happens when a writer introduces, this kind of element, this fantastic element into their fiction. The fairy tale, the ghost, the monster. The rest of the story takes on a kind of peculiar intensity. Landscape, for example, a forest is no longer just a forest. A lake full of swans is not just a lake full of swans. The possibility of transformation is always present. Objects too, the colors that people wear, the food that they eat, animals, drops of blood, everything begins to feel charged with meaning. In a ghost story, everything is haunted, and this carries over to the reader too, the way they see the world when they finish the book. One of my favorite writers is a writer named Howard Waldrop, and he talks about a difference between nighttime logic and daytime logic, and I can't really talk about it the same way that he does. But my version of talking about it is to say that daytime logic is the way that most people sort of interpret the world and the things that go on in it. Time moves forward in a linear fashion. Eggs have egg yolks in them. Daytime logic is tidy. In a daytime logic story, the rules of the world, whether or not it's a realistic story or not, are pretty clear, even when those rules are hard for the characters in the story to obey or to follow. Consequences are plausible. Nighttime logic is closer to dream logic. A writer who is working with nighttime logic may not fully understand the rules of the story or the world themselves, but there's a kind of emotional or intuitive truth to the way that things happen. David Lynch, I think, is a good example at the moment of somebody who uses nighttime logic. Often a story, whether it's fantastic or not, will have some of both kinds of logic, but favor one mode over the other. I think the other way to think about nighttime logic is to think of how carnival disrupts everyday life. Rules become different, life is more vivid, there are cheap souvenirs that cost more than they should. The food may make you sick, but for a short time you get to step outside the everyday, have the feeling that you are seeing things that are normally hidden. China Miéville says, I want to know everything, but I don't want that desire to be satisfied. That is one of the things that a good ghost story, good stories do. They withhold, they refuse to be pinned down to a single meaning. An array of meanings, a flexible, sometimes contradictory, simultaneous, progressive, or recursive sequence of meanings is going to attach itself to the fantastic elements. Those meanings come from a cultural context, from a vast sea of popular entertainment and literature, and your reader's own ideas about what monsters are, what a witch is, the afterlife. Meaning is going to come from all of those things in the reader's own lives that frighten them or haunt them, or which they find inexplicable or wonderful or terrible. So maybe that's a jumping off point for talking.
Well, thank you for that. That was amazing. One more hand, right?
Pushing her by in a stroller as I was up on a stage and there was an audience. And I don't think she could hear me, but people began to clap, and then she looked at the stage and saw me and was just, she looked really angry. She was like, what are you doing? It's one of those looks where, you know, did she feel embarrassed? Did she feel that something was out of place? Did she think I am not, that she was so not one of the audience? Whenever there's any kind of applause, I always think, this is not like normal life. Like your kid is really much more like normal life, where they're just like,
yeah. Yeah. I love when you tell ghost stories at readings. I love when you tell ghost stories at readings. How far back are you able to trace the preoccupation with ghosts, or the haunted, or the strange, or however you want to? How far back are you able to track its origins?
I think back to the point. That's mute. Back to the point where I was actually able to sure. You guys hear me if I just talk?
I think you might just.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we can still do it. That's definitely louder. Back to the point where I had a library card and could sort of pick out books for myself and realize like there was a category of stuff that was really scary. Somebody anthologized on Alfred Hitchcock's behalf, like this anthology series of scary stories, and then Daw did yearly roundups of scary stuff. But like I was probably in third, fourth grade when I realized you could check out whole books of scary stories.
Do you remember any of the authors that initially drew you to them?
Well, they were mostly anthologies,
Sure.
and so. But I remember there's an Emma James story that's one that's not great called Lost Hearts, about a guy who removes the hearts of children in order to extend his own life.
As you do.
She do. And then there was one called The Mezzotint, which is about a haunted photograph, which actually was quite good and still very, very creepy. And then, you know, in the same book there were E. Nesbit stories, there's a story called Man Size in Marble. You know, there were Joan Egan stories. But it was great, and oftentimes I did not remember the author, but if you picked out other anthologies, oftentimes the same stories would pop up a couple of times. So after a certain point, I was like, maybe I should just look for a whole book by this person.
Right. Was Shirley Jackson one of those writers, certainly, or?
Yeah, I'm trying to think which Shirley Jackson story got anthologized the most, though. Probably the story about the husband and wife, one of whom goes out in the world and does good stuff, and one who goes out and sort of wreaks havoc, but then they come back and they swap things the next day. And I think is it One Ordinary Day with Peanuts? Yeah. And then she also has a story called The Demon Lover, and then there's an Elizabeth Bowen story called The Demon Lover, and I definitely remember reading both of those a bunch.
And when does this start to cross over into you actually wanting to orchestrate some of these stories on your own? Like when do you start to say, wait a minute, I can do that?
Well, you know, I in high school wrote one or two stories, which were sort of homework assignments, in which, you know, I was just sort of doing an assignment. I got a good grade, so I thought, that seems fine. But when I went to college, there was a workshop, I went to Columbia. I took a creative writing class from a writer there named Raymond Kennedy, and wrote a ghost story for that. And he was totally fine with that, and also I thought, oh, this seems. I see you can actually write it. But yeah, the high school stories, I think, are sort of stories with. I don't even remember what happened in them, but for the Columbia class, I wrote a ghost story. I thought, I'd like to do more of that.
And what about this sort of like, what about this thing? So I'm just going to ask the worst question. I'm going to ask the big one. Ready? It's a big one. But it's what all of my writer friends ask me to ask you. And it's, hey Kelly, how do you write? That's the actual question. Like, how do you do this? There's so many layers. There's so many things. And how do you want to go about managing that? Do you have a process?
So, like, I think that there's probably like a spectrum of how people work.
Okay.
And my actual working method is I get together with two friends who live in, one town over from me on pretty much daily basis over the course of the week. And they both write mostly novels, I write mostly short stories, but we all sit and we work together. Right now we're mostly working in somebody's house because she hates the world and doesn't want to go out in it. But before that we were meeting in cafes and working. And so there's a lot of writing, but there's also a lot of conversation, there's a lot of talk about publishing, so it's almost like, to me it's the most job-like thing about writing for me is it's almost like there's a lot of conversation around the water cooler, and then somebody will be like, all right, now we need to write for a half hour, and then we'll time it, and then we'll talk a little bit more, and they're like, all right, now we need to actually do some more work for a bit. But there's a lot of talk about career, or does this idea that I'm thinking about seem like a good idea, or have you guys read this book, because it seems to be doing a thing that we've been talking about recently. And so in terms of work life, I think my work life is much more, almost in a sense, office-like than it is. It's great, I really, really like it. I don't know that it would work at all if I didn't have that. But in terms of, when I'm actually writing on the page, I really hate writing for the most part. And yeah. And in fact, I would not do it if there were not other people sort of I can look at and I think, oh look, they're working, and they have a book coming out next year. I could also aim to do sort of, to finish a thing. And the way that I work is that I will have a couple of story ideas that it seem as if they might be interesting. I begin to think about the kind of people that would work in that kind of story and the kind of relationships they have with each other. I almost always have an ending before I have anything else. I will have a kind of ghost story or a kind of story in a fantastic mode that I'm going to write, and then I will think a lot about what I want to happen at the end.
Right.
And then I'll think, but where does it start? What's the starting place?
How often does the ending get preserved over the course of actually writing it? Does it change often?
As far as I know, it's changed significantly, maybe 2 times. Yeah. And both times, it was really exciting. It's like, oh, there's something here that I could do that I didn't realize I could do. But I actually, with Get in Trouble, the last collection, the last story I wrote for that, because I had gone to this conference in Florida where there had been many panel discussions in which people had said over and over again, well, writing is a process of discovery. I wouldn't want to write. I have many good friends who say, well, I wouldn't want to write if I knew the ending because I would know the ending. What would be the point? I always thought, that's not it. I always think, well, I know what the ending is, but the process of discovery is how do I get to that ending? And so for the last story in the book, the lesson, I wrote backwards for about a page and a half, 2 pages, and it's a story in which that was possible because the ending is static. It is a story that doesn't end in any kind of present action. That would have been very difficult to write backwards, but it ends in sort of an emotional space. And so I thought, well, I know what I want the last sentence to be, and I will work backwards, and then I will go back to the beginning and see if I've lined up with that ending, and it did. So I think I think there's a lot of stuff when you write, and when you talk about writing, that you're thinking, no, that wasn't true. I wanted to make sure that when I thought about how I worked, that what I thought about beginning with the ending was true, because it seemed to be so uncommon. I thought, well, maybe I'm doing this wrong. Maybe there'd be maybe if I began with an ending and sort of began with the beginning and try to follow the sentences, I would get to do something really new and different. And I should, in fact, try that. But it feels as if it'll be a lot of work.
Well, I heard, I might have been from you, so I don't know if you've changed your sort of working method, but I remember you mentioning that you were quite, and it was kind of liberating for me because I'm a little like this, but you're quite the kind of story incubator, like you sort of incubate over the story for quite a long time, and then the actual writing process of it doesn't actually take that much of the time with the pie chart of like effort, like authorial effort, like the pie chart of authorial effort.
I think that is still true. I will say that a lot of the time that I spent writing now is I'll write some sentences, I'll make a no. This sentence that I've ended on is a terrible sentence or is a placeholder for something else I haven't figured out, and then I will sit and I will play a game on my phone, or I will read Twitter for about 20 minutes, at which point something has unraveled a little bit, and then I can go back and do it. Or in some case, a week later, I will think, oh, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I find it excruciating to make, if I am writing a story and I'm just sort of throwing stuff on the page, I find it so uncomfortable that I eventually just stop writing. So I incubate before I put it on the page. Right now I'm working on a novel, so it is spending a lot of time in my head, but also it's taking a lot longer just to write, period, than it ever has before.
But can you break down what that incubation process is like? Like, what is it that you're sort of working through? Like, what have you got? What are you looking for at that
Not at the time, because I know what the ending is, and by the time that I've started, I have sort of an idea of the people. Then a lot of it, I think, is figuring out incidents, things that are going to happen that seem to me not to be boring, and figuring out description or language or sort of a pattern of sentences or pieces of dialogue that feel as if they're not boring.
Right, okay. And are you kind of scrapping these together, or are you kind of collecting pieces?
No, I think at this point now what I do is I will, if I think of, like, I spent a lot of time on the plane thinking about stuff. I was a little bit too tired to write, but I was sort of in my head moving a couple of things and thinking, oh, well, here's a line of description that I think is useful here, and here is a thing that I haven't addressed yet, but I think needs to be in here. And some of it is just giving myself a little bit of space before I go back and look at work that I've only sort of had one or two passes on, in which, so I have enough space that when I go back, I think, oh, that's really similar to something I did earlier, or no, the voice here is wrong, or this character is not quite in focus yet in a way that I need them to be.
Right, okay.
So I'll fix that, and then I'll do some new stuff, and then I'll sit and I'll think about what happens next, and then I'll fix the stuff that I just did, almost like leapfrog a little bit.
Right. And this happens even with the two other people that you write with?
Well,
The same process weaves through that?
yeah, and so one of the things that my friend Holly did for me recently is, during the period in which I was spending a lot of time thinking about the book, but had made a lot of starts that felt so wrong to me that I was not really making any progress, she put together a sort of schedule, and I'm forgetting the name of the schedule program at the moment because I'm not relying on it now, but it was, you could sort of set a word count that you were aiming for and a point in time at which you wanted to be finished. And then it was almost like a stairmaster, where you could choose an ascending pattern in which you began with very few words and it sort of built up over time. You do random intervals in which on some days you had to write 300 words and on other days much less. And so when she put it together, I thought that's going to make a lot more sense. And so she set it so that the first day I only had to write 2 words, and the day after that I had to write 4. And sort of built very slowly. And she's kind of a method. She's obsessed with method and process, and with getting work done. And so she's tried many methods. She's constantly changing hers. But there was a point at which she had made a beautiful chart for herself and our other friend, and they got to award themselves gold stickers on days when they had their word count. And she said to me, I could make one for you. And I said, if I want to give myself a gold sticker, I could just give myself a gold sticker. Like this. And so none of the things that she had ever suggested had clicked, but I think the schedule that she built for me, 2 words just felt so, it felt like a weird, I felt that I would be a terrible person if on the first day I could not write at least 2 words. And so I did a bunch of words, and the next day I thought, well, I feel good. I feel good about myself that I, not only adhered to the schedule, but done a lot more than it suggested. And so there's this beautiful period in the beginning where my word count that I had to produce would be like 64 words, but I have written 302, and I feel great. And now we're at the point where I'm supposed to be producing like 700 words a day, and some days now, though, I do nothing, and other days I do, I've had a couple of days where I will do maybe 3,000, and those are great, but I no longer am sort of using it as I was in the beginning. It's sort of a trick to make myself do work.
Would you, and maybe neither of these, but it seems like a lot of writers are either overwriters and that they kind of like write massive tracts and then cut them down, or there are the writers that seem to distill them and eke out every sentence, so it kind of slowly grows in that way. Do you belong to either camp?
I do a little bit of, with short stories I don't. With short stories I am totally happy to rework the same sentence over and over again until it feels right to me. But the idea that I'm going to write scenes or a whole half of a story in which I have to then throw it out is excruciating. And I really felt the same way about novels. I'm now at the point where when I got to around 50,000 words, I knew that there were scenes that, pacing-wise, there was too much. I was going to have to take stuff out. And what it actually felt like when I went back and began to trim those scenes a little bit is I felt great. I would think, previously I thought, this is great, I've written 500 words, and then when I began to do a little bit of cutting, and while I was waiting to figure out what happened next in the part I hadn't written yet, I went back and I honed some stuff, I cut some stuff out, and I think, this is amazing, I cut out 300 words, and it was surprising how good that felt. I'm going to have to do a lot more of it, I think, eventually. Yeah.
Right. You talked a little bit about this sort of slippery metaphor of monsters, and specifically vampires in this case. In a kind of general sense, I'd love to hear how you personally manage sort of I like when you said we kind of have a vampire space that we bring into these stories. I keep thinking of the Hortlack. Has everyone read the Hortlack?
Yeah.
The Hortlack and how zombies are managed in Hortlack is one of those things that I've read the Hortlack 9 times. I have no idea how it's being done. I don't know why I don't care that I don't know certain things. Does that make any sense?
Good.
And I don't know, I'm wondering how conscious, are you able to understand even what I'm talking about as a reader from your side of the table, or?
Yes, which is the benefit of workshop in a way, because you go through workshop and people will tell you the things that they do not understand, and they will either tell you that there needs to be sometimes less explicitly what there needs to be less or more, just that it's not quite right, like the balance isn't right yet. But with, what the process of telling a short story is you already know that you're going to leave a bunch of stuff out. It's the exact opposite of a thing that I really enjoy, which is, the family member or the friend who has watched an episode of television or a movie and then wishes to recount to you the entire movie, whether or not you have seen it. Like a short story is the opposite of that. Where it's much more, the great thing about that, though, that is short story, is it's voice driven. Like the only pleasure of when somebody tells you the plot of Jaws, which my cousin used to like to do, Jaws 3, is it was voice driven, it was his version of Jaws, so it was still kind of great, at least the first time. Well, the short story, you're really gonna leave out as much as you can, but you have to compensate for the fact that you are not going to do stuff that a novel does. I think already the impulse of the short story writer is, or the challenge or the problem is, how do I make people okay with the fact that the short story does not do things that the novel does? And I think for me a lot of the process of writing a short story was a sense that, I don't think this is necessarily true of genre work, because I think genre work is often very pleasure-driven, but literary short fiction is not necessarily always pleasure-driven. It's much more about sort of a particular moment in which a truth, which is often very uncomfortable, sort of comes into a clearer focus. And so what I wanted to figure out how to do that genre does is how to provide novels that to me feel very novelistic, but in the short story form. And that's the thing that I think the tropes of the fantastic sort of do that you are immediately making, in the workshop we're talking about, again, a thing that my friend Holly Black, who's very smart, told me that although I've been an editor for years, I've never thought about, which is that every story or every novel makes a promise on the first page, the thing that narrative is going to be about, the kind of technique, that the writer is going to use to deliver certain kinds of things to the reader. That the central business of the story or the novel is present on the first page. The question of the novel is there. And that if you're a writer, you have to think about what is the promise that you're making on that first page, and is it the right promise? And I think genre work, when you introduce monster or whatever, is already making a promise that things are going to be, one, high stakes, a little bit more high stakes, because already the possibilities are sort of larger than sort of the everyday. Also that we're going to see something that maybe we haven't seen before, or that we don't get to see as much. You know, and that there is going to be some kind of exciting stuff going on. And sometimes the pleasure of the genre story is big stuff is going on in the background, but meanwhile we will look at the small stuff that these characters are going through, because everyday life goes on, even when very large, terrible things are happening.
Right, sure. I think would stone animals possibly belong to that tradition?
Yeah, probably yes. Stone animals is a lot of very, very small movements, but in a weird space. Yeah.
Very creepy as a result.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Let's see. I asked how to help you write, so I'm good on that one. What do you know in terms of cutting? At least for me, I don't know if it's the same for everybody else. To me, most of revision is just snipping stuff out, so that the stuff that's great in there can shine a little brighter. I mean, for you, how do you make? What kind of determinations do you make with cutting? Would you agree? Are you a big cutter, or are you a cutter?
You know, it depends. Like somebody a long time ago gave me a really useful piece of feedback in terms of looking at something as an editor, or for you looking at something as a writer. And I cannot remember who said this, but it said, always look at the ends of paragraphs, at the ends of scenes, and at the ending, make sure that you're not duplicating a thing that you've already done. If you have a description of something, you know, when you scan down this description, make sure that that you're not writing past the point where that description stops being of interest. Mm-hmm. Because I think there is sort of this impulse to, you know, you've done a thing, and so you keep on, you know, doing that move a little bit farther sometimes than you should. But I usually do it the other way, that I will sometimes even think with description or with a scene, I will sort of gesture at something, and then I'll think, I'm going to have to come back and add a little bit more description, or extend this conversation these two people are having. Just there are a couple more things they need to say to each other. So I tend to err on the other side.
Okay. Are you able now, having written as many books as you've written, are you able to sort of measure your evolution as a writer from book to book, or just this sort of shifting proclivities that you have from book to book, or is that too?
A little bit. You know, I think I figured out one thing that happened sort of between the first book and the second book was by the time that we began to put the second collection together, and our press published the first book, and so aside from the editors who've been the editors for the short stories and magazines, I was having to make a lot of editorial decisions about my own work. The order, what I wanted the collection, you know, the progression of the collection to be, all of that, which was interesting. And then also making sure that stuff didn't duplicate between the stories. And then with the second book, we published the hardcover of the second book as well. And I think because it had been so long since I had looked at the first collection, and this huge concern, I thought, what if the second book is not as good as the first book? And, you know, I think the first book was probably really good, and I think this book maybe has not had as much interesting stuff in it. And then I went back and I looked at the first book, and I thought, oh, these are actually not that great. It was this really liberating feeling. It's like, and it wasn't that I had thought those stories were awesome, I just had this concern that the second book was not as good. What I thought was not the second book is better, what I thought was, well, the first book was fine, but it's not as good as I was afraid it was. And I think with the third book, you know, I had an editor, that was the first collection where I had an editor give me feedback, including about things like story order. It was great to have somebody else, you know, sort of pointing out some stuff about how the progression of stories worked. And then the big thing that I noticed, the two things that I noticed, one was that many of the stories were longer. And two, that many of the stories were sort of paired. And I think this is the thing that happens to me a lot, is that I will write a story and then I'll write a second story that has a lot of thematic connections or like leftover material that make them connected. But with the third collection, the echo was I was writing a lot of stories about the same thematic material, but one from the point of view of somebody who was an adolescent, and the companion story was from the point of view of somebody in middle age. And it was fun to sort of, by the time I figured out this pattern, to think, oh, how do the stories read differently if you have two people making the same kind of mistakes or in the same kind of situation, but one is a teenager and one is middle-aged. The middle-aged ones are much creepier. That was a really fun discovery. I thought there's lots of useful thing to have figured out.
I think another reason I really love when you tell ghost stories in your readings is because in your own work, speaking of some themes that arise, there's a lot of work with stories within stories, sometimes plural, sometimes storyless. Certainly two houses is a perfect example, and often you'll like mirror that in reality. It's an interesting technique to kind of cast a spotlight not on the author as narrator, but on a character who is consciously going to narrate a series of things, like the Decameron by Boccaccio or something, which comic came across?
Columbia, yeah.
Right, yeah.
I think that my big takeaway from Columbia was one that geology is really fun and the Decameron is really great. And that New York is a good place to live. Like, those are my big takeaways. Yeah, I loved the Decameron. I really like it. Some of the books I read, I can see why this is an important book, or I can see there's something happening this. But the Decameron I read, I was just like, this is amazing. This is fantastic. And any sort of book or project which has stories within stories, I find, and it's a thing that you can go into overdrive doing that, and you go too far down the rabbit hole. I would actually like to try and do that, like find a way of sort of telescoping that way, because I feel really a little restrained about it. I'm like, I will tell a story from each point of view, or I will do a story in a certain kind of order, and now I kind of think it would be great to sort of go totally overboard with that and just, do too much of it as opposed to sort of doing it in a really organized way. But yeah, no, any kind of, I think one of the things about character and sort of interactions between people in everyday life is how narrative it is. That when my husband comes home or when I come home, we tell each other stories about things that have happened. I will think, oh, here's the thing that I can tell him. A friend of mine recently just sold her house. She has a new house now. She sold her old house, and she sort of said that she'll never, to me and to Holly, she said, you'll never guess who bought the house. And I was like, how would I guess who bought your house? I was like, I don't know, somebody famous, or was it somebody we know? She's like, no, the people who sold us the house bought the house back. And I thought, this is amazing, I get to go home and tell Gavin, and people never guess who bought their house. And so I think that there's, I think that friendships or sort of relationships are often based around the having conversations in which you get to tell each other the kinds of stories. Like, I know there are certain kinds of stories that friends will tell me. I think, if I tell that to Gavin, he's really angry that I told him. Like, it's too gross, or the thing that happens that is uncomfortable. So I'll be like, well, that's a story I'll have to save for somebody else. And so you sort of, I think, maybe this is particular to writers, but, I come from a family of people who are not writers, but they're all people who really like telling stories. I think most people do. And in the way that the kinds of stories that a person tells you something about the relationship, that they have with the person they're telling it to, tells you something about them, the kinds of things that are interesting, and so it's a great way of sort of not just embedding another story in the story, but also giving the reader something about the character.
Are you neurotic first hour, or no? Like,
I don't know. I will say that the terrible thing about working on a novel is the longest it's ever taken me to write a short story is 2 years. And I was not really just working on the story then, it was just stories that were hard. So I'd work on them, I'd go away, and I'd come back. So it wasn't a sustained effort in the way that a novel is. And what I have discovered is novels are so big that it's not so much, I think, well, I'm interested enough to keep going, but I have many more moments in which I feel as I'm writing, and I think, oh, what is the point? You know, what is the point of the thing that I'm doing? And if it's a short story, I think, it doesn't matter if there's a point, it's a short story. And so it only takes, it's only a certain amount of space in a book. I know that there will be other stories in the book. Not every person is going to love every single story in the same way. And so it's okay if the story doesn't work for a certain kind of reader. And with a novel, I think, there has to be a point to what I'm doing. And I'm not honestly sure that there is, except for the fact that I'm sort of sometimes having a good time and sometimes really hating that I'm doing it, but I'm always sort of, I feel as if there's work to be done. I think what I feel about when I write is I think, there's some work I have to do that I don't really enjoy doing, or for whatever reason I feel as if I ought to be doing it. And so I guess I will do it. And the secondary thing I feel with a novel is, well, what is the point of this really? And so it's much more of a crisis point for me. And I know you're working on a novel too now, and I've never really had sort of a crisis of identity in which I thought, why am I doing this thing? And with a novel, I think, no, why am I doing it? Because I am never really sure why I do any kind of work at all, aside from the fact that, you know, I'm making a living at doing it. You know, but I could be doing other kinds of books, I suppose. But with a novel, I'm constantly thinking, well, it seems fine, but what is the point of it? And honestly, I don't think I will ever really know what the point is. You know, hopefully it will be entertaining, but a very large part of me thinks, well, I should be saying something. Like, I have all this space, and a bunch of stuff is going to happen. And if it was a short story, and I thought, I was sort of thinking about a topic, or I was interested in a certain kind of effect that I wanted to sort of produce in a reader. And with a novel, I think, well, I can't narrow it down like that, and it seems much muddier to me. And I really think, I think I'm doing this because I feel like I ought to be doing this, and I want to do it on one level, but I also think perhaps I should be working on an entirely different novel altogether.
Get stressed out, man.
I used to think I was a super relaxed person, and then I have a good friend who, for a couple of decades now, has been a massage therapist, and she said to me, sort of has worked on my shoulders, she said, "You're not a relaxed person." She was like, "You're very, very tense all the time." It's really terrible when somebody tells you a thing about yourself which is in direct conflict with like stuff that you've always believed. Where you think, I'm a mellow person who just sort of goes along with things, and then somebody sort of is like, by your muscles, I can tell that you are, you know, a seething ball of, you know, worry.
I sometimes I think that comes into like not like revealing all the things that people must think of you, like how terrifying that is, of just the sort of not knowing of everything.
I think the not knowing is terrible. Like it's fine to be told that somebody hated your book, but not knowing whether they will like it or not, and like waiting for that is a little terrible.
Oh, that's the worst. Oh, I tell you what, I should probably give you guys a chance to ask some questions, right? You guys want to ask a bunch of questions? Yeah? How do you guys want to do this? All of you at once, just answer. I'll go through about snippets, but I suppose we could hand over mics, right? Is that the best way to do it?
Or if you guys are loud enough, I think it's probably, we'll repeat it.
I bet you. Yeah. Any questions? Yes, Rick.
I'm always curious about people who are sort of professionally creative. How do you decide what ideas in your head to pursue and what ones to just jettison and come like Newton? Like, how do you decide?
That's a great question.
I mean, I think it's probably a sliding scale, but there is a very strong interior voice. I almost think of it as like the on-off switch, where like ideas come to me, and actually terrible ideas are great. Like we actually spend a lot of our time when we're not actually doing work on coming up with terrible projects. And I think that there is a lot more energy in coming up with ridiculous and terrible projects, which is much closer to good work than coming up with things that are sort of in that middle territory. So one of the things that we talk about a lot are romance novels. And so two of my friends swear that at some point they are going to write a trilogy of romance novels. And the first one I think is going to be called Too Many Dukes. And then the second one will be called The Duke's Duke. And the third one will be called Duke, Duke, Goose. And, you know, we spend a lot of time coming up with ideas like that. Like, you know, we will often sort of think, well, sometimes we talk about, like, we'll read, like, a review of a book, and we'll be like, how could such a book exist? Like, clearly somebody will love this book, but the conceit itself is weird, or sort of you think, how would that work? Like, if I were to tackle it. And so I think that the more you sort of allow yourself freedom to play in terms of coming up with stuff that you're never going to do.
Is that a self-confidence thing?
Yeah, no, I think it's play. I think the more you allow yourself permission to play with ideas, to play with things that are of interest to you, the more good ideas that you have. That if you spend too much time thinking about whether or not something is appropriate, or about whether it's, you know, sort of going against everything I just said now about what I'm thinking about my novel, but what you get a lot of energy from allowing yourself a lot of room to play. And by thinking, it doesn't matter if it's good or bad, I'm just going to associate some stuff and sort of allow myself to make connective things that maybe should not fit together, but that seem productive of story. You know, that one of the things in workshop that we're doing is we're looking at the very beginning of people's projects and thinking about what the elements that you have on that first page, what it suggests in terms of genre and potential, and that those sort of promises. And so I think oftentimes now when I write, like, I don't have trouble coming up with ideas, but I will I am pretty quick to, when I am coming up with ideas, sort of latch on to the ones that seem as if I will have the most fun, or there's the most interest to me in terms of pursuing them. Like that I've written enough that there's a category of stuff where I think, no, I've done that a bunch and I would love to do it again, but maybe I should be a little bit farther afield, or here's something that I just read and this is something I haven't thought about, but I bet if I pursue that, there'll be some energy there.
So, we were talking a lot about the sort of mystery, or the fact that these stories are kind of inexplicable, and what Ramon was saying, we don't really know how you do it. When you're writing something that doesn't follow a kind of linear sense, like your stories don't, do you think it's important for the author to know what's going on and every step of the way? I think that's the impression the reader gets from your stories, is that we never really know what happened, but you must know. Is that true?
I think that there are narrative spaces that I am not going to investigate. I'm going to sort of follow certain situations or characters to a certain point, and then maybe I'm going to elide the thing that happens, which is a thing that a lot of people do. Peter Straub does it a ton. And I'm not going to follow the characters into that space, or I'm not going to maybe give you, the thing that I'm sort of leaving out, but I have spent a lot of time thinking about not what I think happened, but I've gone through a bunch of permutations of things that I think could have happened. And I've thought about whether I had set up the possibility that the situations or the things that might happen, that I'm trying to do as much as I can to sort of allow the reader to think X could have happened, or Y could have happened, or Z could have happened. And then if there are things, if there are sort of trains of thought or sort of suppositions that I don't want the reader to make, then I've spent a lot of time sort of removing the material that might push a reader into thinking, well, clearly X is the most likely thing that happened there. So there, it's kind of, I think it's sort of a balancing act. Like, what are the, this, I'm not gonna pin down even for myself what happens here, but I am gonna think about the various possibilities of the thing that happens next, or the thing that I'm sort of circling around. And I'm gonna make sure that that array of things is a little bit under my control in terms of pushing different readers in a certain kind of direction. Or not pushing them away from a certain kind of interpretation.
A couple more. I feel bad that I'm neglecting the back. There in the back. Yes.
So I would love for you to talk a bit about the interplay between being creative yourself and then publishing other people, and how those feed into each other.
Yeah, I really, they're complementary, but they also sort of, I do spend a lot of time worrying. The more time that I spend writing, the less time and energy I had spending doing editorial work. And so I will say in the last couple of years, there have been a couple of times where I feel like as an editor, I've really dropped the ball in terms of getting something back to somebody in a timely fashion. But what I am always going to try and do is make sure that as an editor, the thing, it's a lot like workshop. I feel that if you are committed to work on a project, somebody sends you a book and you sort of say, we want to publish this, but there maybe needs to be some work, the process of doing that work, one is very dependent, on that author's working methods, like what's the way to be most useful to them, but also what are the right questions to ask? Like what can I tell if there are places where I think the novel doesn't quite cohere, or where I feel like we're in the wrong space and the book needs to have a slightly different focus. I want to make sure that the writer and I are in agreement that moving the book in those directions or away from the things that they put on the page seems useful to them, or it feels like the right thing. And that really is asking questions, like making sure that it's almost like, again, you're sort of working as a diagnostic aid for the writer, saying it feels to me as if when you write this scene, you're providing, maybe you're pulling back from the place where the emotional energy of the book is, like, or if the book is ever written, saying, here are these sections where I think you've already supplied enough that the reader is going to do this work for you, and if you put this much on the page, the reader, in fact, is going to drift away because they're no longer as invested. They're not investing themselves into the question of the book because you're giving them all the answers too soon. And so it's really sort of that. You're sort of attempting either to ask questions so that somebody does a little bit more of the thing that they seem to be interested in, or asking them to look at places where maybe they don't feel like they're trusting the reader enough. And so you're saying, I think that give the reader a little bit more work to do here, and the book is going to move better, the pacing is going to work better.
And does that experience resonate back with your process?
Yeah, yes, because if nothing else, I'm having to think about my experience of how a narrative works. And I sort of, for one thing, you see, how you're looking at how somebody else puts a pattern together. And so it's very useful to think about other people's sort of templates for pattern making. And two, it's a lot of the work that you're doing is just reading, you're doing very close reading. And so when you go back to your own work, one, you've had a break from your own work, but two, because you have had to think very closely about somebody else is working with language, how they're setting up situations, the kinds of moves that they're pulling off, I think you do come back to your own work and you become aware of your own work as a series of movements or a kind of pattern in a way that if I didn't do editorial work or teach workshops, that I would feel as if I was sort of doing a bunch of stuff and that I had to figure out, and I wouldn't have sort of this large framework of other people's work to sort of use to negotiate my own sort of method.
Maybe one more? Is that okay? Okay, one more, you guys? Yes, go ahead.
Do you think, you spoke a little bit about literary fiction as being more truth-driven and pleasure-driven when comparing like genre and literary, and I'm like obsessed with this comparison. So do you consider literary fiction to be a genre, and if so, what are its tropes that you might have noticed?
I think that the point, if you go through any sort of MFA program, then you are sort of benchmark for what any sort of genre fiction, including literary fiction, is the work that people talked about when you were in your MFA program, and the work that you read when you were looking at those magazines, and the kind of people who are held up as exemplars of people who were doing something which was interesting, innovative, worth looking at. And so, I think that anybody who went through an MFA program like I did in the 90s, that there was this sort of idea of the New Yorker story, which is, and I think probably everybody in that period has the idea of the moment of a quiet epiphany. And it's bizarre to me that the words quiet epiphany are like part of a common vocabulary of how people talk about a kind of story, because of course the stories are not just that kind of story, but once you introduce sort of the idea of a quiet epiphany, then when you look at stories you think, and here it is, here's the moment of quiet epiphany. It's like a weird bird out in the wild or something. And so, this is sort of a really reductive way to talk about a kind of thing that a literary short story does, and I don't think it's true anymore. I think literary fiction has gotten a lot weirder than that since then. But there is a kind of mimetic fiction, I think, which is very interested in the moment in which somebody realizes something about their life or themselves, that there's a kind of psychological or analytical sort of template in which maybe the reader sees before the character does something about this person's life. And maybe, in fact, the character never sees it at all. And there's enormous power in that, because there's this anxiety, interesting sort of productive anxiety, when the way that you see a character is different than the way that the character sees themselves. It has a real narrative energy to it. But what I liked about genre work is that there were other things going on besides that. That there was sort of, you could do that in a story, but you could also put in a lot of other weird shit. And it did not sort of detract from, the moment in which a character realizes or doesn't realize something. That both of those things were, and that this was in fact something that genre fiction, was already doing, and experimental fiction was also doing. That, so I don't mean to talk about literary fiction in a particularly reductive way. I love Joy Williams' short stories. I love Grace Paley's short stories. There are a lot of people who are writing stories in which nothing out of the ordinary happens, but which still feel really startling. It's just that there's all this other stuff that I write as well.
Well, thank you guys guys so much. That was amazing.